Nearly a decade after the Fukushima nuclear disaster, Japan's government's considering releasing more than 1 million tons of treated radioactive water into the sea. But how will people in the area and Japan's neighbours react? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Imran Khan. It's been nearly 10 years since the Fukushima nuclear disaster and Japan's still struggling to manage its consequences. One of the most serious challenges involves some 1.2 million tonnes of contaminated water that's still being stored near the site. This week, Japanese media reported the government's considering releasing that water into the Pacific Ocean, something that's prompted complaints from Japanese fishermen and neighbouring governments. We'll bring in our guests in just a moment, but first, let's remind you of what happened at the Fukushima nuclear power plant. The site was destroyed by a powerful earthquake and a tsunami that struck off the northeastern coast of Japan in March of 2011. In the days that followed, its cooling systems failed and tons of radioactive material leaked into the air and sea. Japan's government designated a large evacuation zone around the plant, and more than 150,000 people were forced to leave their homes. An extensive operation to decommission the plant is expected to take decades. But the plant's operator now says they're running out of space to store the contaminated water. Let's bring in our guests now. In Amsterdam, Jan Haverkamp, senior expert on nuclear energy and energy policy at Greenpeace. In Tokyo, Michael Penn, president of the Shingetsu news agency, and also in Tokyo, Tomohiko Taniguchi, a former special advisor to the cabinet of Shinzo Abe, also professor at the Keio University Graduate School of System Design and Management. Welcome to you all. I'd like to begin in Tokyo with you, Tomohiko Taniguchi. The fact that they're doing this now, the fact that they are considering releasing this treated radioactive water into the Pacific Ocean has many people alarmed. Why would they dump radioactive water into the Pacific Ocean?
There are two kinds of names to call that water. And Mr. Khan, you're using two descriptions. One is to call it contaminated, another treated. The fact of the matter is, it is a vast amount of treated water, no longer contaminated, because there is an arrangement and a system called ALPS, that is Advanced Liquid Processing System. The only remaining radioactive material is tritium. But everyone knows that tritium is in ample supply in natural waters of all kinds. It is in the human body. And if you ask anyone in this field, even if you drink the water that has tritium in it, it'll cause no harm. And so the Japanese government, under the advice given by the IAEA, has been considering ways to release the water, either to vapor that into the air or to release that into the sea. And I think in a week or so, the government is going to have a decision.
But why are the government considering releasing it into the Pacific Ocean if they do have other options?
Well, it is the easiest way, and given the huge amount of treated water, I think it is the swift and easiest way. And indeed, that's exactly what all the nuclear power plants across the world have been doing for years and decades.
But those nuclear power plants haven't been destroyed in a tsunami and an earthquake. I mean, this is a very distinct case, surely.
Well, that's one point that you should mention. But the other thing is, the total amount of tritium released by some nuclear power plants around Japan, actually, in volume, have been bigger in amount than the entire amount of tritium stored on site at the Fukushima Daiichi power plant.
So you would be happy for your family, once this has happened and the water has gone into the Pacific Ocean, to eat the fish that is fished in those waters. You'd be happy to drink from those waters, to go into those waters if you ever went to the beach. You think it's all business as usual?
Fishermen are grossly unhappy. And that's why this is difficult. And that's why it's taken years for the Japanese government to consider this, despite the call from the IAEA to move swiftly. And I think it's going to take some more months to negotiate between the fishing community and the central government. I think there must be some sort of understanding cut between the two parties.
Jan Haverkamp in Amsterdam. It's all perfectly safe. It's been treated. This is on advice from various different scientific organizations. What is there to worry about?
Well, at the moment that I hear the word treated being used instead of contaminated, I can't think differently than this is a kind of newspeak. Yes, the water is treated, but the system that is treating it, the ALP system, is not as effective as it was hoped to be many years ago when they started using it. And the water that we're talking about is still contaminated. It still has traces of strontium-90 and other isotopes where ALPS has not been able to function optimally. Of course, the biggest problem that we do face is tritium in the water, and then coming forward and saying, well, that is not a problem. Tritium is being emitted everywhere in the world and it's in the seawater. Yes, but we're going to talk about a large amount of tritium that's going to be put into the ecosystem directly near to or directly in the Fukushima prefecture. I think the crucial words that we just have heard was swift and easy. That is what TEPCO and the Japanese government would like to do. They want to get rid of this problem swift and easy so that everybody will forget about it. Especially these attempts have been going on already for a long time. We've seen attempts to make Fukushima, trying to make Fukushima go away, for instance, in the run-up to the Olympic Games that were planned for this year that are now delayed to next year. The Fukushima Daiichi nuclear problem is a large problem. And I think I have to say that I have a lot of compassion for the fishermen and other people who are making their living in the Fukushima prefecture and around it, and who fear for their income at the moment that this will take place. And we have been arguing already for years that it is better to take your time, to take care that treatment is happening to levels which are under the acceptable levels, and not take sudden decisions that will cause amounts of water being emitted that do not meet the normal criteria.
But Jan Haverkamp, isn't there something a bit more concrete you can tell us? I mean, you're saying actually the fishermen might be kind of up in arms about this and a little bit upset about this, but you haven't actually said what the effect of that contaminated, that treated water going into the Pacific Ocean might be. And our guest in Tokyo suggests that there won't be any effect.
Well, if there would have been very clear science about low levels of radiation, very clear science about how tritium is behaving itself in ecosystems, then we would be able to have another discussion about this. The problem is that exact science is not there. There's a lot of uncertainty about the effects of tritium. For instance, the Canadian Water Board is using criteria which are 20 times as sharp as the criteria which are, for instance, used by the IAEA. And they do that with good reason, because they have found out that there is a lot of uncertainty and that there are effects that should weigh into that whole discussion. Now, at the moment that you're talking about these kind of uncertainties, you use the so-called precautionary principle. And in this case, that is not a problem at all. There's no problem at all in storing more water over time and continuing to search for better ways to treat this water, and at a certain moment get this water treated to a way that it fulfills the criteria before it is then released into, for instance, the ocean. But at this moment, what we see is indeed swift and easy. We see pressure on the whole system, not for scientific reasons, but simply for economic reasons.
Let's bring in Michael Penn here. He's also in Tokyo. He's the president of the Shingetsu news agency. Michael, this has clearly been a huge talking point in Japan itself. It seems to me, given what I've been reading, that the first line of defense against dumping this water into the Pacific Ocean is the fishermen and the fishing industry. What are their objections to all of this?
Well, I think it's instinctually most people could understand what it is. The two previous guests have kind of shown you already the spectrum of the scientific debate. On the one hand, you have the Japanese government, which very much insists there's absolutely no danger here. And then you have other critics who say, well, we don't know for certain that it's dangerous, but we don't know for certain that it's not. So there's, they're saying there's an uncertainty about whether or not there might be a problem down the road from releasing this water into the ocean. But whether or not, whichever side the scientific argument is on, I think there is a great deal of certainty that when people read in their newspapers that treated, contaminated water from the Fukushima Daiichi disaster is being dumped into the Pacific Ocean near Fukushima, that it's going to have an effect on the ability of these fishermen to be able to sell their fish, because people are going to say, well, we're not 100% sure it is safe. Now, that could be bad reporting, or it could be a scientific discretion or just being prudent. But the reality, the economic reality for these fishermen is real. And you can expect that their businesses will be damaged by it, whether or not it's safe or not safe.
But Michael, just take the temperature for us in Japan. Is the public behind this move? Is it a popular move to say that actually the water is safe, it can be dumped, or are people divided? I just want to know what the Japanese public might be thinking.
Well, to be honest, I haven't seen a specific poll that's asked about that, so I cannot answer that question with precision. But I would say that because of the history on the Fukushima issue, particularly before the accident, when the government did insist that everything was quite safe with the operation of nuclear plants, and because of things like revelations that TEPCO knew years in advance of the accident that a tsunami could potentially do damage enough to create such an accident. Essentially there were, you could argue, lies told to the public in the past about nuclear power. And so because of that, justified or not, I think a lot of people look at government claims and TEPCO's claims, TEPCO being the operator of the plant, with a great deal of skepticism. And, people, I don't think anybody would like the idea that the seafood on their plate comes from a place where treated radioactive water has been recently dumped. So, again, it's a matter of perception, whichever side the reality is on.
Tomohiko Taniguchi, it's a matter of perception. Your government hasn't got the confidence of the people because of things that have happened in the past. Do you think the government will be able to push this through if that's the path it decides to go down?
Truly, it is a matter of perception, not a matter of science. Perception sometimes does matter than anything else, which is to be understood by anyone dealing with this issue. But when it comes to scientific evidence, a huge amount of evidence has already been there, in the sense that fish stocks that fishing community near Fukushima Daiichi relies upon is not contaminated. So the complaints and worries, understandably, for the fishing community around the power plant are much to do with the perception. And they are telling the Japanese government to do more on the perception. And as your guest from the Netherlands says, if it's possible for the Tokyo Electric Power Company to take years before things are going to be settled, they could do that. But they have already built 1,000, nearly 1,000 tanks, and on site in the plant, there is very little room physically left for them to continue to build tanks. And I think 2021, I think next year, is going to be the limit, which is why the sense of urgency has kicked in.
Jan Haverkamp, what's your reaction?
Well, that is exactly what we're talking about. First of all, I mean, the science, I just want to make one remark about the science here. There is no clarity about the amount of radioactive substances that is still remaining in the 1.2 million tons that TEPCO wants to emit into the ocean. They also are going to take 2 more years to prepare for that. So we even don't know exactly what the situation will be by then. But what we do know is that the government, with its blunt certainty and lack of wanting to talk about uncertainties, for years already has been saying, we can do this, we are doing this. And every time again, it appeared again that the ALP system, for instance, was not performing to what it needed to do. So those are the doubts that we have and that we see all around us are justified. Of course, the amount of space on site is limited and is slowly getting full. To go beyond that and be aware that in the closed zone, there is still ample space, but that will cost, and it comes to a cost. The reason why TEPCO wants to continue with this is a question of cost. It's trying to cut costs, and with that, risk indeed the livelihood of, for instance, the fishery community there, but also of other people who are trying to make their livelihoods in the Fukushima prefecture.
But Jan Haverkamp, we do have to be realistic here. There is an economic consideration to take into consideration. There is, you have to make this cost effective. And what our guest in Tokyo is saying is that this is the most cost effective way of doing it.
Well, the most cost-effective way would have been to take the heat, to take the warnings for large tsunami seriously and invest at that time. We have now seen a catastrophe for which TEPCO is trying to budge its responsibility time and again. And this is one of the very many instances where TEPCO is trying to do that. And I am very sympathetic to my Japanese friends in the region who say, we've seen this once, twice, tens, dozens of times happening. TEPCO tries to get away from it because, of course, it is struggling. Of course, it is struggling economically. But it is the responsibility that it is carrying for the catastrophe that it has caused. And walking away from that responsibility and then in the process destroying the livelihoods of even more people than they've already done is not acceptable.
Tomohiko Taniguchi, why is this under consideration and not the vaporization plan? Is the vaporization plan much more expensive?
Of course, it's going to be much, much more expensive, and it'll take much, much more time. In terms of the availability for the tanks, it's full stop. I have been there on site and have taken a close look at how narrow the space has already become. And so it's going to be impossible for TEPCO, responsible or not, to make more tanks. But
why doesn't TEPCO?
For those worried about contamination, I should suggest you go to Canadian nuclear plant called Bruce Nuclear Generating Station in Ontario and test the water to see how contaminated it is. Tritium has been released from that plant in a massive number, and that has caused no harm to the fishing community nearby.
But Tomohiko, you're talking about TEPCO being responsible for this. Now, as I understand it, it's not just TEPCO. This has to be the Japanese government as well. They have to take much more responsibility than they have done. Is that right?
Certainly it is, in the first place, TEPCO's responsibility. Building those massive number of tanks has come from the shrinking profit of TEPCO. So long as TEPCO could carry on, it is TEPCO's responsibility.
Michael Penn, what do the Japanese people think of that? What did the journalists there in Japan think of that? It's, this is effectively a private company that is managing a national ecological disaster.
Well, that line is not really so clear in Japan. Effectively, in the wake of the accident, TEPCO was more or less nationalized in terms of its structure of who's calling the shots. But that was, when you talk about the big industrial enterprises like this, they always work very closely with the ministries which oversee them. And so, this isn't the system of the business structure in Japan isn't exactly the same as you would see in Europe or the United States, where there's a pretty clear distinction between the public and private sector.
So what you're saying is, Michael, that the Japanese government isn't doing enough, but it could.
Well, let's put it this way. It's the Japanese government that's ultimately calling the shots, I think would be a fair assessment. The ministries which are involved are the ones who are, it's probably ministry bureaucrats who are making the key decisions, not some, private sector individuals who are operating on their own.
Jan Haverkamp, the Japanese government then is responsible and needs to do more. What's the international response to that? Is there any international pressure that can be put on and aid and help to the Japanese government?
Well, there's several forms of international pressure going on at this moment. First of all, this issue has already been discussed in the International Maritime Organization, and it will come back there again, because there are international obligations that on Japan that do not allow it to make these kind of emissions. So we will see that kind of international pressure continue on the Japanese government to come to another decision. Then, of course, there is also possible further support, especially in the realm of detritiation. So that means removing tritium from that water. There are developments going on, technical developments at this moment, that would need implementation, and it will not be easy. And it is one of the big problems that we face with Fukushima after the disaster is we've absolutely not been prepared for a disaster of this kind, and we're trying to mitigate its impacts on the go, on the fly, so to speak, and that is very clearly visible here as well. We did not have the technology on beforehand to clean up water and detritiate it properly. We have to think of that now when we are heading into head-on into these problems. These developments are ongoing, and the Japanese government, instead of keeping that on arm's length, should intensify.
Jan Haverkamp, we are running out of time, and there is one very quick question I want to ask all three of you before we go. 1.2 million tons of treated radioactive water may well go into the Pacific Ocean. Tomohiko, would you eat Japanese fish after that happens?
Certainly, I would rather drink that water myself.
Michael Penn, would you?
I'm not sure I want to go dump into the tank and drink the water, but in terms of eating seafood in Japan, I wouldn't have a problem with it, and I will eat seafood in Japan.
Jan Haverkamp, you were shaking your head there. You're not going to eat any Japanese seafood if this happens?
I'm vegetarian and I don't eat fish, so for me the question is a bit easier there. But seaweed, for instance, Japanese seaweed, is on my menu regularly, and I find it a delicacy.
I want to thank all our guests, Jan Haverkamp, Tomohiko, Taniguchi and Michael Penn. And thank you too for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And you can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Imran Khan, and the entire team here in Doha. Bye for now.